Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to Healing from Racial Trauma with Mosaic and the St. Pete Underground. If you don't know who we are, the St. Pete Underground is a nonprofit faith-based organization that exists to inspire, equip, and empower missionaries. We feel like it's super important to discuss just racial justice in general and navigating that, especially for leaders of color. Some of you guys have either been in ministry or been in your job roles, and it's very hard to come by spaces that will support and empower and equip leaders of color specific to their needs. And so this is going to be a space where we just address racial trauma. We talk about it. We discuss it. There's going to be some laughter, probably some crying. Just let yourself feel and come open and ready. I am going to start by saying hi, good morning. I'm going to start by sharing just our slides so you can see what we have going on here. It was giving me a little trouble today, and it might give me some trouble again. So in the meantime, Michelle, do you think you can introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle. I am a registered mental health counselor intern here in the state of Florida. I live in Orlando, and I'm happy to be with all of you today and talk about this topic of healing from racial trauma and how to go about that. And so I believe I'm going to go ahead and start with the welcome. Is that what we were doing next?
Yes, I'm gonna try to get the screen up. Here we go.
Okay.
It was giving me some issues before. Really quick, before you do that,
Mhm.
I'm going to have us just look at some of these. So these quick details are, first off, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Michelle or myself will kind of keep an eye on it and try to answer it as best we can and as quickly as we can. Also, fam, let's give everyone our undivided attention. So if you have something to write with, now would be the time to grab it. If you need to get some water, you could, blurt out your screen or whatever. But really, let's stay engaged here this morning. And then, because we are going to ask you for your feedback, so we want some answers in response. And then smile. You're on camera, like I said, but don't worry, your privacy is safe. So Michelle's going to get ready with a welcome statement. If you want to take that away, Michelle.
Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to welcome us all into this space. Those of us living with chronic medical conditions, visible and invisible, dyslexics, your dreams and desires and passions, first languages spoken by people here, Spanish, English, Portuguese, others, survivors, people of Latino, Hispanic descent, African descent, Asian descent, Native American descent, people who identify as activists, and those of us who don't. Those of you who are in your teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and higher. Those of you who want to be here to learn, to relate, to find community. Those of you who are single, married, partnered, dating, or maybe it's complicated. Your emotions, your joy and bliss, your grief and rage, your indignation, contentment, disappointment, and other feelings you might be having. Those of you, those who support you being here, and those who make it possible, your families. The mystics and seekers and believers and skeptics of all kind. Those dear to us who have gone on, our elders, those who live and those who have passed away. I welcome all of us into this space.
Thank you for that, Michelle. That was beautiful. And that's just a way for us to remind each other and to communicate to you guys that wherever your background is, wherever you come from, you're welcome in this space. This is a safe space. I want to reiterate that because things will come up. The things we talk about here are going to be intense. And so I just want you guys to know that wherever you're coming from, we welcome you and we're ready to dive in with you and walk with you through this. Okay? Cool? Thumbs up in the videos if I see, or you could, yeah, there we go. I still got to change mine to a brown thumb. I have it as a yellow thumb, and I kind of got called out last night by a friend, but he was like, you need to change yours to a brown thumb, but I'm going to do it before the meeting next time. Okay, let's jump right in. So I want you to describe yourself in 3 words. So think about who you are as a person, what you like to do. Maybe you're all about family. Maybe you're Dominicana like me. One time for the Dominicans in the room. Hey, there they are. Okay, hey, okay. Sorry, I had to shout out. Okay, so maybe there's words that describe you. I just want you to write 3 words that describe you. You could say them, which would be most engaging, or you could just type them in the chat. I'm gonna hope for some brave souls that unmute their mics to say their 3 words, but I'll give you guys a minute or so to look at that. Just those 3 words to describe yourself. Is everybody ready? Let's see. All right. Go ahead.
I'll say mine. I'll say mine out loud.
Okay, perfect. Yes, here we go. Someone brave. Let's do this.
Believer, dad, and husband.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you.
And Brenda's typing hers in, even though we're speaking right now.
That's totally fine. That's okay. That is okay, y'all.
I'll go ahead and share. I have mine as creative, inspiring, and compassionate.
Those are so true about you, Tay. Okay, that's my cousin, by the way, guys. Sorry, I'm so happy. Okay, yes, I love those. I love those.
Okay, I'll go share.
Okay.
I'm gonna say Afro Latina, loving and loyal.
That's right. That's my sister. My whole family's pretty much in here, y'all. So, but I promised I wouldn't make this about them. So, yeah. Okay. Anyone else have some 3 words here? Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Bueller? To dating myself with that movie. Okay, we have some in the comments. I lost my voice, so chat will be my friend. Honest, loving, and thoughtful. Good, okay. Christ follower, Colombian, and a mom. Okay. Analytical, flexible, and persistent. Compassionate, dedicated leader. Honest, loyal, and compassionate. Black, balanced, and methodical. Very true about you, Evan. Loud, passionate, and genuine. Disciple, thinker, empathetic. Nice. Nice. Oh, and then LaShawn said strong, care, and compassionate. That's awesome. You guys are so well-rounded. I love it. Michelle, what would your 3 words be?
I think mine would be Black, teacher, and compassionate.
Okay, good. Gosh, mine would definitely have to be Afro Latina. I don't know, man. Afro Latina, curious, and fun. I don't know. There's probably better words, but I feel like all the things that fuel me are my curiosity, and I'm always wanting to have a party for every little thing. So, oh, activist, yes. Thanks, Carmen. Okay, so moving right along. I just wanted to share a little bit about us. So we've been doing probably racial justice work all of our lives, as people of color in general, with or without knowing it. But specifically for me, I think racial justice, specifically in St. Petersburg, is a huge topic that I think people either skirt around because we are a tourist space, or we don't want to address it in general. And so there's been a lot of protests happening in my city every day for the past 100 days. And I've been to a few of those marches, but I think most importantly, I've been curious about, what people are saying, how people are responding, how people are either ignoring or supporting what the protesters in our city are doing. I would consider myself an activist. I call my politicians, I cuss them out. I get really passionate about just the leadership in our world. And so, but I also think that, I also weep when there is another shooting. I also mourn and try to grieve as much as I can when I feel numb about a specific, racial incident that's caused by vicarious trauma. And so, yeah, I would say that that's kind of my personality when it comes to these kinds of issues. I don't want to shy away from it. I want to talk about it. I want to see how our people are doing. I want to check in and really just offer the best kind of support that I can. So, that's a little bit about me in terms of racial justice. Michelle, did you want to share a little bit more about you and the work you've been doing?
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat as Jen. I tell people I live in Orlando, but I live about 30 minutes north of Orlando. It's just easier to tell people that. But I actually grew up in Sanford. And Sanford is where the Trayvon Martin murder happened back in 2012, I believe it was. So I was very involved in the community when that was happening. I saw a lot of the stuff that was going on. And like Jen said, like growing up as, being born a person of color, you automatically are an activist, whether or not you want it or not. But I think when that murder happened, that's really when I started to get more involved, and I started to ask more questions of like my leadership, specifically of the church I was going to, and really wanting us to be better in the way that we address these issues, and really wanting to look at like the structural racism that was happening in our community and in the country ultimately. So a lot of my work right now is around a lot of like consulting with different people. I write a lot of articles about how we could be better allies, or how, really white people can be better allies to our communities. And then and also I look at like, what does it mean when we look at like reparations? What does it look like when we talk about apologies? Like what is a proper apology? And what are we asking for? Ultimately, what is all of this for? So that's a lot of the work that I'm doing right now around my community here and people that I influence.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Michelle. Yeah, we grew up, my sister and I grew up in Sanford too. My cousins are from that area. So yeah, that was a very prominent thing to have experienced, and to kind of that be the marker that fueled more of your active justice work as well. Okay, we are gonna head out. I don't know, hold on a second. Let me do something. This is bothering me. We're gonna talk about different forms of trauma. Before we do that, we're also gonna discuss the journey of healing. So if in the comments or in the chat, or voicing to us, I want you to put kind of where you feel like you're at when it comes to race-related issues. Like, are you just tired? Are you angry? Are you, like, list all of those. Are you grieving? Are you wounded? Are you resilient? Do you feel like, yeah, racial things happen, but I'm in a space where I know the healing process that I need? Or like, just, I want to see where people are at. So put in the comments, in the chat, just like, when you think about racial justice and racial issues, what's coming up for you? What stage do you feel like you're at in the process? Yeah, and maybe one of those isn't one that we mentioned. Maybe you're feeling a different kind of way when it comes to racial trauma. Maybe you're feeling hopeful right now in the season that you're in the community you're surrounding with. Tired, learning to live with grief. Yeah, Yeah, what else is coming up for you? Maybe for you, you're like numb to the situation. Some people feel numb. Um, Overwhelmed too. Yep. Honestly, it depends. Some days anger, other days are overwhelmed and numbness. Some folks who feel like, they understand it to be an issue or they see it as an issue, but they're trying to figure out how, like, where they fit into it. They maybe feel displaced, confused, sad, helpless. Yeah, these are all journeys of healing and grief. Yeah. Yeah, Carmen said numb, heavy-hearted, exhausted, hopeful, determined to try to influence change. So we all kind of have where we're at. We want this feeling of, oh, okay, yeah, LaShawn said scared. Scared, like that's a real feeling too in our day-to-day, fed up, angry, feeling like it's time to fight back. Yeah, there's definitely that response when it comes to experiencing racism. Yeah. And that's the bridge, just, what Pedro said about working towards reconciliation with those who don't understand our plight. That's kind of the work that Michelle's been doing, to try to communicate with anti-racist allies who are ready to stand with us, but also, just acknowledging our own exhaustion, our own anger, our own pain is super crucial. Yeah, a lot of people are feeling mentally exhausted because it's like, this is just going to keep happening over time. So let's get into the journey of healing, and then we're gonna identify some forms of racial trauma, so you guys can have some language around what it is that we're going to talk about today. Let's see here. So if I'm going to do this correctly, it should show me. Okay. It doesn't want to show me these. Hold on a second. Here we go. Okay, so kind of what you guys were talking about. These are typically this is the journey of healing that's lined out in the book Healing Racial Trauma by Sheila Wise Rowe. It's a book on one of our resource guides we're going to give you, but essentially she talks about this journey of healing from racial trauma. It begins with the wounds, identifying the wounds, feeling the fatigue and responding to fatigue. So she actually talks about forms of fatigue, which is a little bit more of what LaShawn was talking about, like, the folding or the fighting or the fleeing. She kind of describes that a little bit. So I highly recommend looking into her book, but she goes on to talk about silence, where there's a period where we just get so tired that we grow silent of what's actually happening. Oh yeah, okay, so we have some other things that came up. So it's a marathon, sometimes running, then walking, but always moving, usually somewhere in between indignant, guarded, and critically hopeful. Yeah, so this is kind of that healing journey, but we move into a time of silence where there's just, we don't want to talk to anybody, we don't want to do anything, we just feel completely helpless, helpless. And then in that space, there's this numbness. Then there's rage, right? There's that anger we talked about, the frustration of like, I'm just so done with this and I'm ready to pack up and move somewhere else and all these things. Then there's that fear, talking about being scared. But then there's a time of lament. So we have to lament just everything that was lost, everything that was stolen from us, all the lives that were stolen from us, all the people, things like that, things that had affected us. Which may bring on some shame, which is part of the identification of like just healing from this trauma is going to cause all of these things. And it's going to lead to these kinds of things. There's addiction there, but I think there's also just in that regard, it's just when we've lamented and we feel the shame right now, the addiction piece is just, we need something to fill the void, right? So like, I don't know if some of you guys have felt really defeated by some racial trauma and some things that go on, but oftentimes it's like, okay, well, what can distract me from actually feeling what I need to feel? What can fill this void that I now have because I've lamented and I feel the shame, or I have all these emotions. And this isn't like a straightway path either. Like you're bouncing from all of these things constantly. But then the idea too is that you find freedom. There's opportunity to express. Instead of suppressing how we feel, we are able to express how we're feeling. We're able to get the healing that we need, seek counsel, seek therapy, work through the trauma we've experienced. And then there's that resilience that when something does come up and something does happen, we have the strength to fight back in a healthy way. We have the strength to move forward. And to sort of take on a lot of what's happening in the world, understanding that these are our elements of healing. And this is the process in which we heal. If any of you guys on this call have ever lost anybody, you know the stages of grief. You know kind of what happens to your body, physically, emotionally, spiritually, as you're trying to navigate your own healing. So this is a very similar experience. We're not going to get too much into these today, but I highly recommend looking up that book. I'll put it in the chat so you guys can have access to it, but we also have it on a worksheet for you at the end. But I just wanted us to identify these healing stages. Today we're going to be talking about specifically the forms of racial trauma. So that's just something to keep in mind throughout this call. When we talk about racial trauma, we're going to be referring to these kinds of definitions, and we're going to go through each of these definitions. A lot of times people don't understand that racial trauma can have different forms. I've talked to so many people of color who have said, like, I don't know where this comes from, but I'm feeling this, or I don't know how to pinpoint or explain this, but this is a part of who I am or what's going on in my world. And so there's historical trauma, transgenerational trauma, personal racial trauma, physical trauma, vicarious trauma, and then there's microaggressions and gaslighting. So we're going to get through those definitions. If you have something to write with, you can write it down. You can also screenshot the slides, whatever you feel like is necessary. But we're going to just go right through it. Okay. So historical trauma. Historical trauma, defined by this book specifically, talks about how a cultural group of trauma, it's a cultural group trauma that spans over generations from historical impact. The suggestion that the book gives us is really about the loss of cultural identity and language. So over time, something that's happened to a specific people group is now affecting historical generations and cultures of people. The example they use is actually with things like slavery and the First Nations communities that were in this country, for the Native Americans who lived here when a lot of the Europeans came over and started to assimilate them to their culture. What they ended up doing is they brought children to boarding schools. They'd cut off their hair. They made them learn English. And so from that, there was very much a loss of identity. They really were wondering kind of how do they regain their cultural identity because it's been stolen from them. And then that gets passed down generation to generation based on this one cultural group experience. That's very similar to slavery in the sense that there was something taken from that cultural group, and now generations have to struggle to figure it out. But that is historical trauma. We're going to move on to the next one. Transgenerational trauma is a specific family trauma or genetic trauma that's actually passed down from generation to generation. So there's not a lot of conclusive studies about this, but there's a lot of studies around how the body remembers certain types of trauma and how that stuff gets stored into DNA and then gets passed down from generation to generation. This is found true in heart disease or any sort of cancers, things like that, things that are unexplainable, but it's almost why, there's this prevalent number among these different community groups, Latinos and Hispanics, Latinos and Black folk who experience these certain traumas over a period of time. There's like, okay, increased heart rate problems or increased blood pressure, increase this. It's basically the response to that historical trauma being passed down from generation to generation. and then creating this health issue for a lot of global groups or communal groups, racial groups. And then it's also having that same collective question sort of passed down from generation of like, who am I to the world, right? So maybe your family never really addressed their own racial tensions and issues, so you're having to search for that yourself. So for me specifically, our family has so much shame wrapped around like our African descent that it is literally a puzzle to try to go back and figure out these questions of like, who am I? Where do we come from? You know, let's take all of these. That's where the DNA testing comes from for like the ancestry. You know, we're just trying to find pieces of our past, but it's linked with this trauma where we were actually ripped of our identities. And so part of that is this constant search and quest to figure out who we are. And to also think about who we can trust, you know. So as a transgenerational trauma occurs, we're also associating, okay, who can we trust, who can we not trust? This is very similar to how people pass down certain ideas or identities around other people groups, right? We've never trusted these people for X amount of years, and that's just like who we are. So when kids come into the scene, or you know, the new generation comes, it's now passed on to them, this hatred or this pain or this frustration when it comes to a certain people group. And so those are the things that get transgenerationally passed. The next thing we're going to talk about is personal trauma. So as far as personal trauma goes, this is very self-explanatory. Oh wait, I'm sorry, Michelle, I just saw your comment. Go ahead and say what you're going to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about the transgenerational trauma from like a studies perspective. So, because I recently did a talk on transgenerational trauma and we looked at different studies, and there's two specifically that come to mind. There was one done, and I can't remember the year it was done, but it looked at the Jewish community specifically, and they found that like the grandchildren of Jewish people who had been alive during the Holocaust and experienced concentration camps were having these adverse reactions to that history, even though they themselves, these grandchildren, had never experienced any of that. And so that's one study that was done. And the other study that was done was specifically on lab rats, where they took the parents and they had them smell, I think it was like a smell of like cherry blossom or something. And so they looked at their children who had never had the smell introduced to them before. But they also, the children of these lab rats were having an adverse reaction to the cherry blossom smell, even though they had never experienced it before. So they were looking at that and saying, is it possible that these things can be passed down through the DNA, like what Jen is talking about? Can trauma, can adverse reactions, can things like that be passed down through generations? And so that's what they're looking at. And so there's a term for it, it's called epigenetics. So if you're interested in looking at how trauma can be passed down through generations, regardless of culture, religion, or anything like that, epigenetics is definitely something to look into.
And this can be also, you know, attributed to things that we can't really name when it comes to our trauma. You know, I know for a fact that we're still in the process of trying to figure out our family history. You know, for our family, it's figuring out the past and who hurt who and who excommunicated themselves from the family and everything. But when you find out that information, you realize, oh man, there was trauma that was built up there that I suffer with too. You know, a lot of you guys who have ever dealt with depression or anxiety, you know, that has probably come somewhere from somebody older than you in your family line who's experienced that as well. Thank you so much for that, Michelle. We're going to continue on here. Talking about personal racial trauma. So these are personal traumatic experiences that affect an individual over a span of their lifetime. The example they use from the book is really just about the author's father, who had experienced a racial experience where he was being called the N-word, there was things thrown at him, but he also had experienced a death of his friend who he didn't necessarily he cared for them, but he didn't really mourn well. He didn't grieve well during that process. And because he had joined the Nation of Islam and was very connected to Malcolm X, it was during his lifetime that Malcolm X was assassinated, and then also Martin was assassinated as well. So he now had these 3 deaths he was trying to mourn and grieve, but because they were piling up on each other, they affected him personally because it was so close to just things that he had been fighting for. He never really was able to grieve them properly, but he knew that all of these were race-related deaths. And so that kind of affected him as well, along with his own personal trauma that he had been experiencing. And really, that's any personal trauma that's been coming back up over time. So if over the course of your life, the personal racial trauma you might experience can happen with your hair. It can happen with other parts of your body. There's people who are like, I hate my nose, I hate my body features, or things like that. It's your own personal experiences with what's going on in your world that can keep happening over the span of your lifetime and cause collective trauma. Let's see here. Then there's the vicarious trauma. We're all familiar to this one. That one has a lot to do with just what we see on the news, on the television screen, on our phones. It is very much, sorry, hold on. I'm trying to get the chat box away so I can read what this says. Let's see here. Okay, we're gonna move this. Give me 1 second, guys. Thanks for your patience. There we go. Okay. So vicarious trauma is, again, hearing, seeing, or reading about a detailed traumatic experience once or even repeatedly, which causes secondary traumatic stress. So that's going to be any of your videos that you see on Facebook or Instagram, on social media. That's going to be any news stories that come out that you read about. Anything that is kind of just in your face. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I'm scrolling and those videos just automatically start and I have to like X out of them quickly to protect myself because vicarious trauma can happen. And I think since people have started recording police officers in those kinds of encounters, it's been helpful to bring some sort of justice or at least have some evidence against those who are committing these crimes, but it also gets put on display for us to see and witness. And so it kind of just can affect our whole mood, our whole day. And yeah, I think for us, that's the kind of trauma that is also really, it affects us in a lot of different ways. It's also the kind of trauma that makes us feel this sense of connection to the person we've never even met, right? So it's this like, if we've seen somebody who's experienced this, this trauma and we're witness to that in any way through the hearing or seeing or reading, there is this sort of like collective mourning and grieving that happens when we weep over a stranger because we understand sort of that that historical racial trauma tied to all of that. The history of police officers in this country, the history of all of that, like it kind of, all these traumas sort of tack onto each other, especially in vicarious settings where we're witnessing it happen in front of us. And then there's microaggressions and gaslighting. So these are just racially insensitive remarks or hassles. I love that she put hassles because I was like, man, that's a perfect explanation. It's like extra hoops we have to jump through for being people of color. And yeah, it's just, hassles or nonverbal messages. Gaslighting also happens when people sort of question those microaggressions or they're invalidated in their experiences. So, so that's anything from, someone touching your hair to someone saying you look pretty for a Black girl, or, those kinds of remarks or things. I was reading in the book about microaggressions, and one of them explained like having to go to like a certain section of the store and see that your hair products are locked up because you're assuming that people of color are going to steal the hair products when all the white hair products are out for everyone to see and grab and touch and take. So, and not knowing that that was actually a form of a microaggression, an assumption on a people group because you're trying to give them access to their hair products, but they, you know, it's locked up. We have to get somebody to open it. And that's happened at the Walmart that I'm in several times. So, so yeah, I think that's one of the things that is just so frustrating, but it's even more frustrating when there's gaslighting that happens and when people just invalidate your experiences. So I don't know if you guys have ever had that experience where you've explained that this isn't fair, or you should be treated this way, or that person shouldn't have said that. And then someone kind of leans over and is like, maybe you're just being extra sensitive, or maybe, maybe it's all in your head, or whatever, some sort of invalidation that causes you to think that you're insane, or that you are overreacting. That's the term, that gaslighting. That typically, I would say the gaslighting and the microaggressions will happen a lot over social media as well, because, you know, the gaslighting are those Facebook comments, are those trolls who basically are like, well, you know, here's all the research I've done as a white person to explain to you why you shouldn't feel the trauma that you're feeling. So yeah, that happens from time to time. And that's just, you know, stuff that adds to our trauma. It's actually, you know, it's labeled as trauma because over time, that is kind of what happens. We've experienced these microaggressions. We've experienced all these other forms of trauma. Gaslighting and microaggressions are just as severe in the detriment of our trauma. So we're gonna take a quick breakout session, and I want to give you guys a chance to just discuss which form do you relate to most and why. I'm going to go back to the other slide and have those listed for you, but it's historical racial trauma, transgenerational trauma, personal racial trauma, physical trauma, vicarious trauma, microaggressions, and gaslighting. So if there was one that resonated with you, that you remember the most, stick with that. But I'm going to put us in, I'm going to stop sharing here. I'll put the question in the chat here. Which form do you relate to most and why? And then I'm going to label them here. And then we'll get you into breakout groups here in a second. Everybody with me so far? Want to put a thumbs up? Yes, no? Here we go. There's some brown thumbs. This also may be a lot for you. I think if it is, or if it gets any kind of intense, just, you know, don't be afraid to feel, but also, you know, understand your boundaries, your own boundaries for sharing and not sharing and things like that. The healing is as far as you want it to go, but part of it, we know as a community, it's about collectively talking about it and sharing what's going on with us. So I am going to pause the
Okay, so yeah, so the next part, and I'll wait until the slides are up, but we're just going to start talking about what are the effects, like what is race-based stress, what, how does it manifest? Like we're gonna talk about imposter syndrome, and then we'll also talk about like, what are things that you can do to start coping with these things? Because we talk a lot about like what they are, but we don't really talk about what can we do right now to deal with the effects that we're dealing with. So let me pull this up. Okay. So, or sorry, can you go back to the last slide? Yeah, so basically, what is race-based stress? It is, simply put, it is psychological distress associated with experiences of racism. And, you know, and this stress can go across a lot of different things. That you can have work-based stress, you can have family-based stress, but in this instance, we're talking specifically about race-based stress and how it can manifest. So some of the ways that we find that it does manifest is that it can come out in anger, anxiety, paranoia, fear, depression, self-blame, sadness, frustration, hopelessness, helplessness, resentment, self-doubt, and isolation. And I know for myself, probably in the last like 4 months or so, a lot of these have been coming up for me. And so I'm wondering, and this can be thrown in the chat, or you can say this out loud, but do you relate to any of these, or do you notice, like looking at this list, like, oh yeah, I have been experiencing a lot of anxiety, or I have been experiencing a lot of depression or self-doubt?
I know for me, it's a little bit of each, in a sense that, you know, since May up until like beginning of June up to now, is that, you know, that anger at what's going on in our society, that fear of, you know, what's going to happen next, especially come November time, is that it's a pivotal type of thing. And, you know, just like you, I'm a counselor. And so I have to grapple with that. I'm human as well, but I also have to provide help to others who are feeling this. And so drawing that line that, you know, struggling with my own self-doubt and my frustrations, like, okay, now I had to put a pause button and help my clients get through the same kind of feelings, you know, I'm dealing with. And so it's a lot, you know, this last couple months is these triggering of these different emotions.
Yeah, so, and I hear like a couple things from what you're saying. I hear like this fear of the unknown. I know I've been experiencing that too, the fear of the unknown of like, okay, there's a lot going on right now, and we still have 2 months until, you know, an election. Like what is happening between now and then? And then also this like back and forth of like, how do I support myself, but then how do I support other people as well, especially since you're a counselor and you have that responsibility too. Anyone else?
So I can certainly relate to the anger, anxiety, paranoia, fear, resentment, frustration. You know, I'm a 46-year-old man of color who likes to jog, and 2020 has been an interesting year. And you know, I've seen the faces when I jog with my dog or with the kids or my wife versus when I'm alone. I see the faces when I move to a more Caucasian dominated area of Florida, and all of a sudden I'm in a leadership position. You know, I see the faces when I have to stop the gaslighting as the senior leader where I'm at right now. And you know, I can see it. I can feel the paranoia sometimes when I'm running on the street, you know. So I certainly relate to a lot of these.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like juggling, like in your daily life and the different roles that you hold, you're juggling so many different emotions, and some of them simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think it gets to the point where you just try to ignore a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
At least I do.
Yeah. And then in the chat, I see Evan said paranoia, frustration, helplessness, hopelessness, resentment, and anger. Pedro said resentment and frustration. And Jen said her husband, Evan, loves running, but I don't doubt that his fear of running alone has caused him to scale back from running. Is there anybody else before we move on? Pedro, hopeless that this will ever change on this side of heaven. Yeah, definitely been feeling that. And so, you know, when we experience stress, whether it's race-based stress or it's stress coming from something else, it kind of goes back to what Jen was talking about, how there's like there tends to be a void or something that we're trying to fill it with. So we experience stress, we're trying to find ways to cope with that. If we're experiencing depression, we find ways to cope with that. And this is no different. And so with the race-based stress, there are ways that we can find to cope with it, whether they're healthy coping mechanisms like going out with our community, doing things we like, self-care, going out in nature, but there's also ways that we can fall into ineffective coping. And so the next slide just talks about a couple ways that we fall into ineffective coping. It can be in the form of disengagement. It can be in the form of avoidance, substance use, but again, that goes back to kind of what Jen was saying, where it's like we're trying to fill it with something to distract us, or we're feeling numb, so we're trying to not feel numb anymore, and then self-destructive behavior. I know for myself, there's been a lot of disengagement. I think after June, the month of June was over. In July, things were still pretty like hot and heavy, but like I felt like I needed to disengage from, especially social media. I needed to disengage from a lot of the work I was doing with different people. And so I took a break, and it was really nice. But then when I came out of that, it was like the wave hit me again. So the ineffective coping, the disengagement can be healthy or it can be unhealthy. It just depends on how you do it. And if anybody wants to speak to anything on this, you can, but if not, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So another thing that typically happens too, so when we're experiencing race-based stress, or we're in environments with people who maybe don't look like us, we don't see ourselves represented, there's this phenomenon called imposter syndrome. And close my chat so I can see this. Okay, so imposter syndrome, it typically occurs when you do not believe you are as intellectually capable as your peers, or have the skills necessary to fulfill the requirements of the various roles that you hold. So it is a belief or a feeling that you have that can actually cause you to diminish your accomplishments. Let's say that you are hired at a job, and you have the skills and you have the values for this job, but you don't see people who look like you. And so then the thought creeps in, maybe you were a diversity hire. And this, an imposter syndrome can go across many different demographics. It can go across socioeconomic, gender, race, ethnicity, everything. But in this case, we tend to see imposter syndrome really pop up with people of color, because a lot of the spaces that we tend to navigate are spaces where we don't see ourselves represented a lot. And so I see this specifically because I do a lot of work in higher education. I definitely see this with my students of color when I'm, involved in an institution that is a PWI, like a predominantly white institution, and the students of color don't see themselves represented. And so they tend to fall into imposter syndrome, thinking that they got into the school because the school needed to meet a quota. And that might not necessarily be true, but the feeling is still valid and still real based on what we know historically. So the next slide talks about some of the effects that can happen from imposter syndrome. So a lot of them are pretty similar to the effects of race-based stress. You have sadness, shame, fear, denial of competence. So this is a really interesting thing. So the imposter syndrome causes you to feel like you are not competent, that somehow you tricked these people into giving you this position, letting you into the school, letting you do this thing. And so because you have this denial of your competence, you have this fear that the truth will come out, and that you'll be found out, and that you'll be called a phony or fired or whatever the case is. And so because of that fear that you have of being found out, you tend to then go into this next point, which is overachievement. You feel the need to be really successful, do your job well, which being an overachiever isn't necessarily a bad thing. But when it's coupled with all of these other things like sadness and shame and fear, it can be very detrimental. So you have this denial of your competence where you think you're not, confident enough to do this job. So in order to cope with that, you overachieve. And people who deal with imposter syndrome have a really good ability to put on a mask and put out this front that they know what they're doing. And the reality is they do know what they're doing, but they put out the front to other people. But internally, they're like, I'm not cut out for this. It can lead to guilt and anxiety, and the life dissatisfaction is because of those two warring feelings you have of the denial of competence and then the overachievement, which when you're out in the world, you're overachieving. When you're alone, you go home at night, you're in denial of your competence. And so those two things are warring with each other, which is leading to the life dissatisfaction. And then the paranoia. And so I'm wondering with this, can anybody speak to this? Do you see things on here that you're like, oh yes, I have experienced this, I have experienced imposter syndrome?
I mean, I think I can definitely speak to that. I've lived in situations and been a part of companies and people groups that I felt like I had to work definitely twice as hard as a person of color, just to prove myself to my white counterparts, but also to like, you know, I was in ministry for a long time, and part of that was like your appearance really mattered, I think, in some cases. And so I would like try really hard to like tie back my hair during fundraising meetings so that people didn't feel like they were giving their money to like somebody who was just a beggar or whatever. And I was like, you know, because I didn't want people to feel uncomfortable around me. So I felt that denial of competence, like maybe I'm not really cut out for this, or maybe I don't look like what a missionary should look like, you know, enough to where people feel trusted to like support me financially. And so I was constantly like just trying to just kind of hide traces of who I was so that there was a way in which I could be perceived as accepted, or to seem competent, right? So I had that denial of competence. So I would overachieve. I would like print out, you know, 2 resumes instead of just, oh, you should always print out a lot, but I would print out like a ton because I was like, I don't want a stain on here, because if there's a stain on the resume, they're going to think I'm like, you know, this or that, or they're going to assume stuff about me. And I would like try really hard to like just look really good on paper and everything, like look like I have it all together. Especially also as like a photographer, I would constantly photograph families that had a better socioeconomic status than I did. And so I had to kind of fake it until I made it like, yeah, of course, like this is the equipment I use and I'm really skilled and blah blah blah. But really I was just nervous that if they saw the real me, that they would think I was to this or to that based on my race.
Yeah. And I
So
see. Oh, go ahead.
we're having a debate on whether or not whether or not this comes into effect with like I've known I've had to work harder to get to where I'm at, and I've known I've been an active part of I've been actively discriminated against because of my skin color in leadership roles, and you know, the same people that throw out the diversity statements right away. And I'm just shaking my head like, you know, I know better. I've seen it. I can give you names of where you're really coming from. But I don't know that the overachievement for me comes from this, because I never, like, I don't feel like I'm a 3 in the Enneagram, and there's never a situation where I don't feel like the most competent person involved, whether it's, you know, work related or even, you know, whatever. So I don't know. I don't know if that's just part of this, and or maybe I don't know.
But even as missionaries, I feel like people look at us and well, I think we get a lot of judgment because of his position with the government and stuff like that, and not the right. I don't think that we get like they look at us and they're like, you guys are missionaries, kind of like
The credibility.
yeah. So.
There's some folks in the comments that are saying, Elizabeth said what Jen said is very true. Pedro said, why are they the standard? Why do we have to live feeling like we have to prove ourselves to them? And Carmen said, I feel you, Pedro. And it's crazy how all of these things are the effects. Like it's interesting. We have these racial experiences, we have the trauma, we experience imposter syndrome, and then there's even effects to imposter syndrome. So it's like layers within layers of why we do what we do, and that being all wrapped up in the trauma we experience. So yeah, I can't answer your question, Pedro. There's a whole historical context to that too. That takes a lot to unpack, and there's the weight of that too, and understanding why they were always the standard from the beginning. But or maybe not necessarily from the beginning, maybe from like the 1800s is what I'm learning. But yeah, I think that's something to definitely explore and unpack a little bit of like stay curious about those things and begin the healing work there.
Yeah, and I definitely find it interesting too, like what Jen was just saying, like, you know, we have all the traumas, we have the definition for racism, we know what it is, we see imposter syndrome, we know what it is, yet we're still trying to achieve this goal that we will never be able to achieve, because at the end of the day, we could do everything right, but we'll never be white. So it's an interesting thing, because it's almost like you have to play the game in this country in order to survive and not be gaslit and not be blackballed. So was there anything else that anybody wanted to say about this? Okay. So with all of that said and all of that looked at, how do we begin to cope with race-based stress and trauma, as well as imposter syndrome? And I think one of the first things we have to look at, I think it's on the next slide, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this is one of my favorite things to talk with people about, especially like when I'm in a like a counseling capacity, and people are having like dysfunction in their lives, and we're like, okay, let's go back to the very beginning, or let's look at your basic needs. And so I believe that this can be applied to what we experience with race-based stress and trauma. And so when we look at Maslow's hierarchy, he believed that, okay, I was just reading the chat, sorry. So he believed that humanity's goal is self-actualization, that you want to achieve your full potential, and this includes all of your creative activities and outlets and things like that. But it is impossible to achieve self-actualization if all of these other things aren't met. It doesn't matter if you, like, you can't create this great work of art if you don't have food. You need the most basic needs met first, and then you slowly start to work your way up the chain towards the creative, the full potential, things like that. And so when we look, you know, so like putting ourselves, you know, in our own social locations as people of color, when we look at the very basic needs, like physiological needs, like, are you eating? Like in this time of racial stress that we've been experiencing for years, but right now very acutely in the last couple months, like, are you eating well? Like, are you drinking water? Are you, do you have like shelter? Like just those basic things. And then like, I'm really, really big on rest. Like, are you resting? And I feel like out of the four, that's like the one that we all tend to not do well, because somebody commented something on Facebook and we have to respond. Or somebody reached out to us because they want to ask you as their one friend of color, how are you doing? How are you doing today? I had a lot of people reach out to me, asking me how I'm doing. And I just started copying and pasting responses because I was just over it. I appreciate it, but at the same time, it was just a lot. And so when we look at rest, there's this, which I believe it will be on the resource handout that we're going to give out at the end, but there is an Instagram page called the Nap Ministry. And one of their quotes that they say is that rest is a form of reparations. And I tell that to whoever will listen, because when you come from an ancestry or a history where you were not allowed to rest, where that was not a part of the deal for you, and then now being able to take part in that and really claim that within a society or a system that was never created for me to thrive, but I'm taking back my rest, that is like it's like a middle finger to the system. So, and then also in addition to that, there is a quote by Audre Lorde that I absolutely love, where, and I don't want to get this wrong, so I wrote it down, but she says that caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And so, like, again, living in a system that was never created for us to thrive and reach our full potential and cater to us, to care for yourself is an act of political warfare. It is waging war against the machine. So rest is, as you can tell, rest is really a big point that I talk about a lot. And then moving up from that, we look at like safety needs. Like, do you physically feel safe? Do you feel secure where you are? Like a couple slides back when we were talking about, I forgot exactly what it was, but a couple of you brought up the aspect of running and going jogging and not feeling as safe now to do that. I mean, I don't know a lot of people who felt like people of color who felt safe doing that anyway, but especially now given what's been going on and what's happened. And so looking at your safety needs and adjusting and changing what needs to be done so that you do feel safe. And then from that, belongingness and love needs. So looking at your intimate relationships, like who in your life right now is supporting you in the way that you need? Who is, giving you that like unconditional love that you desire? And with family, it's a little bit easier, but like when you look at your friend group, who in your friend group is really trying to understand you right now? And then moving up from that, your esteem needs. So your feelings of accomplishments, and this kind of goes to the imposter syndrome. Like, do you feel competent? Do you feel like you are in a role where you're able to succeed? And then the idea is that if all of these needs are being met, then, you can reach your full potential. You can dive into the things that you love, the creative parts of you, and living the life that you've imagined for yourself. So that is how I interpret the Maslow's hierarchy of needs in regards to, being BIPOC. And then the next slide are just some other recommendations. But actually, I want to pause right here and go back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs really quick. Is there anything there that anybody wants to speak to?
I think for me on the hierarchy, like I have the physiological needs. I mean, as a tired mom, you get back and forth with like the rest part aspect of it. But I think for me, where I kind of get lost, it's that belongingness mix, like basically those last, like the top three pillars, because I feel like they kind of coincide a little bit. Like when you feel belonged, you feel empowered and encouraged by others, and then that boosts up your self-esteem, and then that in turn like helps you self-actualize your motives to get your goals and things done. And so for me, like that's where I feel like I'm trapped right now. Like it's that feeling of belongingness and trying to find a community out here that I no longer have, having moved. So I love that you shared this chart. It's very helpful and I really appreciate it.
Definitely. Yeah, and I find a lot of times working with people, like the three top ones are the ones that people kind of go back and forth and struggle with, because those tend to be the hardest. The basic needs like food and water are pretty easy from time to time to work with, but the last three are difficult. Is there anyone else? I'm putting that quote from Audre Lorde in the chat in case anybody wanted to see it.
Thank you.
I think for me, there is this, like you said, rest was the hardest for the physiological needs. I think I've had many a restless night when I'm thinking about like my husband and my son and our family and just like how the world perceives us. And it has a lot to do with the fear that I hold inside. So that kind of keeps me from dreaming, honestly, sometimes about like I've told my husband this before, but like sometimes I'm afraid that I won't be able to like dream for my son's future because I'm just scared to like hope for him and wonder like what'll happen. And I think that fear keeps me from resting physically. And I also feel that like, yeah, just like that ties very much into the safety needs, the security, the safety of our home and like who we are as a people and like what can self-defense look like for us if we're trying to protect our home one day from intruders or you know, what does actual safety look like when you can't call the police? Like what, for me, I'm like thinking about those things too, and wondering like, how do we navigate that, or what do we contextualize that to when it's just not a reality for us sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I'm hearing that like a lot too, like the dreaming part, like it's hard, I think, between the racial unrest, COVID, the election, like it's really hard to like think in the future and think of things getting better because it just seems so heavy right now. So these are just some other recommendations. So and coping with, you know, the racial stress and trauma and imposter syndrome is your support network. It kind of goes back, and a lot of these kind of go back to the Maslow hierarchy of needs, but what does your circle look like? Who do you go to for support? And especially now, this might be a thing that needs to be edited. Who is in your circle? Do they provide you with the guidance that you need? So that's one thing, is looking at your support network. Also spirituality. I know for a lot of BIPOC and in our history, spirituality plays a really big role in coping with stress, coping with like present time. And so tapping into, you know, whatever it is that we need to in that capacity, whether it's going to, I mean, maybe not now, but engaging in the local church, engaging in prayer meetings, engaging in Bible studies, leaning on that support. And then looking at positive cultural identity. I think a lot of times for us, we see ourselves represented in negative ways. And so looking for individuals, whether it's like present day, historical, who have positive identities and represent us and look like us, and what they did to cope with whatever it was they were going on with, or whatever was going on with them at the time that they existed. Did they tap into spirituality? Did they tap into a support network? What did that look like? How did that come about for them? So really researching those historical figures or present day figures and seeing what they did. Also positive reinterpretations. So there's, you know, a lot of times this kind of goes with imposter syndrome as well. You have to stop and identify the negative thought. A lot of times we have these thoughts and we allow them to run rampant. But if we're able to stop the thought and identify what it is, so let's say it's, I was only hired for this job because they needed a diversity hire or something like that. So we've identified the negative thought. Then we perform a reality check. So the reality check might be, well, I looked at the job description, and you going through the job description, you're like, okay, well, I do meet this, and I do have competence in this, and I can do this. So the reality is, I actually do fit the job description for this. Because a lot of times our thoughts and feelings have a way of distorting the reality of what's in front of us. And then making a positive reinterpretation. You take that negative thought, you've performed a reality check on it, and then you might say, okay, based on the fact that I do meet these qualifications, the hiring board saw my qualifications, they looked at their job description, and they decided that I was the best candidate for this job. And so that's sort of how you go through that, of identifying the thought, performing a reality check, and then reinterpreting it to be positive instead of negative. And then the last one is simply setting boundaries, which is always difficult, which is, I talk with a lot of people, a lot of clients and students about, you need to set boundaries, and it's so much easier said than done, but you start off small. And I know from personal experience, I recently had to set some boundaries with friends, and it was with all of the racial things going on, and realizing that I could no longer be friends with these individuals because they were still part of my previous church that had caused so much harm when it came to race and racial reconciliation. And I no longer am a part of that or institution, but these two friends were, and there was a lot of strife going on in the relationship. And so finally I just told them, hey, we need to have a conversation. And so we talked for a couple hours, and you know, we didn't say in that moment that we weren't going to be friends anymore, that, you know, we weren't going to engage with each other anymore. But after the conversation happened and the weeks went on, it became very clear that like, I can't be friends and I have to set that boundary with them, because it's harmful for me as a person of color to be friends with two individuals who are still very heavily involved with an institution that caused me so much harm. And so while we're still friendly, there is that boundary. And so I think boundary setting is paramount to especially what's going on now. Is there anything on here that anybody would like to speak to?
So, and you know, I have a question actually. So being a therapist, which I'm actually going to school right now to get my master's in counseling, have you encountered any couples that like have a support system, but they're in interracial relationships? So people that are white American and have another, that are with a multicultural individual, like how they're dealing with this and how they're able to find support like with each other. Like, I don't know if you've counseled anybody, and what is your word of advice for those types of dynamics?
Yeah, so on a professional level, I have not, but on a personal level, I myself I'm in an interracial relationship. So my partner is white, and so I've had to have a lot of hard conversations because, you know, he grew up in an environment that looks like him in a very small town in the Pacific Northwest, and just didn't have to think about certain things. And so I've had to have conversations, very basic ones that are almost annoying, that, you know, people of color grow up having all the time. Like, what is race? What is racism? What does it look like? And then having to draw on a lot of historical things. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but I understand what you're saying, because I've had to have these conversations.
We can talk more maybe like a little bit later, more about it. So I have some other and more in-depth things, but we can, we'll talk more afterwards if you're okay with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And was there anything else that anybody else wanted to say about these recommendations before we move on to the next part?
I think they're really helpful. Honestly, I think they kind of pinpoint what we as a community respond best to as well. I know for a fact, like with our son, we're trying to really instill just figures and leaders in history who persevered through certain moments, or who sort of upset the system with their own activism. I've taken him to protests with me, and his favorite thing to say when he opens the door is, "We need to change the world, people." And no justice, no peace. So I feel like we're on the right track. I think that I want him to have that positive cultural identity, and you know, something that we didn't really get to have growing up, but also something that's going to remind him that, you know, we're going to go ahead and tell him who he is and where he comes from before the world does. And then he can navigate his own activism throughout what's happening. But I realize that these recommendations are uplifting to us as a community, and they help us protect ourselves and kind of go back to that pyramid structure of like having your base, having your security and safety. But those things don't come unless we've kind of set those boundaries or understood our own cultural identity. So I like this a lot. Thank you for this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do appreciate, I think one that kind of resonates with me, it's in a different way, is the positive reinterpretations, especially in light of when it comes to gaslighting and microaggressions, where, at least the way that I'm reading it, that positive reinterpretation is just resetting the narrative that we hear all the time. And it's just not like Xing out the facts, but just understanding that, like it's been mentioned before, you know, this system is not made for us. The news is not made for us. A lot of the mainstream stuff is not made for our ears and our eyes. So just having this healthy way of repositioning and considering that this is not made for us. Is not the first time that these stories have been told about us in a negative way, but also going forward, just understanding that you know, we are more than just a 30-second clip of somebody being unrightfully shot. and not being brought to justice, not ignoring those things, but also uh, having a broader sense of who we are and where we come from, and then also where we're going as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
So we kind of been talking about this in general, and this can be a space for us to kind of share a little bit more about how we've been feeling with the content we talked about today. Michelle, did you have anything else to add um, on top of that, or just to wrap up in conclusion?
Um, I would say like that it's a lot of information. It's a lot to deal with on top of everything else we're already dealing with. But I would say just be gentle with yourself and be patient with yourself and know that like none of this is linear. It goes back and forth constantly. So if you feel like you've progressed and then you feel like you're regressing, you're not regressing. You're going through the natural flow of just being human.
Yes. And always refer back to that journey of healing, because your emotions will feel on that gamut. It's really how you respond and react to it, instead of using those ineffective coping mechanisms, really pressing into these other ways of coping that Michelle's laid out for us, I think is going to be the better progress that we need. These group discussion questions are just some questions. You guys can answer one or all three. You can answer them in the chat or vocalize it. But what's one thing that's you've really learned today that you maybe didn't know before? What can healing now begin to look like for you in your own way? And then this is just like a dreaming exercise, but thinking about your life 5 years from now, what do you hope to tell your future self about like how your healing journey looked like? So yeah, you can answer any of those questions in the chat or answer them, like unmute yourself. We're going to give some space to do that. We've got a couple more things and then we'll wrap up. I think our wrap up time is probably around 12:20, 12:30. So we might be finishing a little early. So yeah, I just want to hear from you guys. I can start. I think one thing I said in the chat was that I'm struggling to have a conversation with one of my white friends that I've known for 10 years, who's really just been avoiding all things race related. She moved to North Carolina and she has her own life there now. And I very much feel like I could basically just fade into the bushes, and nothing would change. So I think this is really challenging me as part of my healing to set boundaries, because then I'll be able to honor the fact that there needs to be boundaries set, and that kind of what Michelle was saying, that we can no longer be friends, and I need to like declare that for myself and for her. And it's going to be hard and painful and something I don't want to do, but it's kind of been weighing on my heart for a little bit. So I think that's part of my healing journey. That's an invitation for me to protect myself and preserve myself by setting that boundary. Pedro says that one thing he learned was the different types of racial trauma, and it challenges him to dig deeper into his history. Healing is required for him to sit and to have difficult conversations with people in his circles that are white and who are not experiencing the same things that he has. Being intentional about engaging white folks in his community.
So I think for me, one thing that I learned today, I kind of knew about the different types of traumas, but now it was good to see them all kind of ordered up. But the Maslow's hierarchy needs, I think, is a good reminder of where I need to set my priorities. And as far as what healing is going to look like for me, I think that's going to be a very proactive part on my side. Like I need to go and get I think I need to not only find myself a community that I'm going to feel that's going to bring healing, that's going to help, that I'm going to be able to find solidarity with. I think that getting personal like psychotherapy help will help too as well, to be able to like talk it out in situations, especially in the environment that I'm in that I'm still kind of questioning. And then what my life will look like 5 years from now. I would hope that I'm a little bit more proactive in making a change. By then, I'm hoping to help other people in the healing process, similar, Michelle, to what you do, and serve others that are hurting in regards to the pain that they've been inflicted, especially through racial trauma. So thank you for this conference.
Thanks so much for sharing. If there's any other emotions or feelings that you guys have, feel free to share them in the chat. You know, these are going to be reflection times. We want you to process on your own too as well. But I want to leave us with a quote from one of my favorite artists. She's wonderful, but back in 2015, she was dealing with some of that transgenerational historical trauma, of things that happened to her life and things that her mother and her grandmother went through, and just things that were going on with her. And she said, trauma skips generations until it reaches someone able to heal it. And when they do, they heal 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And so this is from Kalani. I like it. I think it reminds me that I'm doing the work today for my future generations, right? We're teaching our son to see, you know, representations of himself in as a hero, as a teacher, as a leader, not just for himself, but for his grandkids and his great grandkids. And I'm doing the healing work, my own personal healing work, you know, and I'm trying to heal back, you know, my mom, what she experienced, and my grandmother and my great grandmother, and like all of that. So I really feel this because it honors my past, and then it helps me dream for the future. So yeah, I just wanted to share this quote with you that I stumbled upon, and I want to hear what you guys have to say. There was somebody in the chat. He said, "Thank you for sharing this. Thank you all for sharing. Let's continue to pray for each other. Have a great weekend." Yeah. So yeah. Do you guys have any questions on some of the content we provided? Any at all? Specific questions? No? Okay. In your inbox, you actually already have an email in your inbox if you registered with us. It's got this handy little guide that basically has book recommendations that help you process maybe what you're feeling, any sort of racial trauma stress that you're trying to navigate through. On this list are also BIPOC mental health counselors. So we have Michelle. She's available for consultation and to just discuss with you what you want your healing to look like. Taylor, who was on the call earlier, she's also a registered mental health counselor intern with her practice and can be reached there. I've also reached out to Antoine McKenzie. He is a registered mental health counselor intern as well in Davies, Florida, near Miami. So they're all doing telehealth. So you can contact them or text them or call and set up your appointments with them. It's really important for us to invest in our mental health, especially during this time. And these folks are going to be really good at being available with racial related trauma and stress. We also have some Instagram accounts that you can check out run by people of color. They have really inspiring quotes if you're just needing to fill your space with some more positive affirmations of who you are as a person of color. Take time to look at those. And then also just be mindful of taking care of your emotional and mental well-being. We really want these resources to help serve you as you do ministry, as you do work life, as you do family life, every situation and space that you're in. But we also understand that it can be stressful and overwhelming to begin the journey. So feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on there. We also have a director of care with the St. Pete Underground, Jasmine Fong. So she's always happy to help kind of process with you what the next steps in your journey are, and we'll try to get you the help that you need. But this is in your inbox along with a little surprise that I put in there, a little bonus surprise. But we just thank you guys so much for being a part of this. We know it's never easy to talk about racial issues and at least get healing from them. So I'm really glad that you guys stuck around and made it to the end. But yeah, do you guys have any other questions for us? We'll share a little bit about tomorrow. So tomorrow you'll use the same main session room that we used on Friday and this morning. If you don't know where that is, you're gonna go to www.stpeteunderground.com/mosaic. Tomorrow, if you've been a part of it, it's actually, sorry, Mosaic 2020. I'm putting it in the chat right now. Tomorrow, if you've ever been a part of our virtual prayer space, I know Brenda and Nefti, you guys were part of that. Last time we did it, it was really powerful, just a space where we got to reflect and actually write down just some of our thoughts and feelings. And it's an open space, so there's really not going to be any talking or any leading. It's really just a communal space to deposit your emotions and feelings. So we'll prompt you about that, but that's going to be on that link. That's tomorrow at 10 a.m. and it'll go for a couple hours. We've got some poetry for you tomorrow as well. But yeah, we really appreciate you guys taking the time to be with us this weekend, and we hope this serves you. Feel free to reach out to either of us if you have any other questions. Ellie said this has been an amazing experience. Good. I'm glad we could help. Our hope was to put some language to how we've been feeling as a community, because it's just so hard to figure it out, to navigate it. So thank you guys, and we hope to see you tomorrow morning. Again, check your inboxes for a little surprise from us, and we hope you guys have a great rest of your Saturday.